Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Okay, so Jay, you've had a really unusual career path. Can you share something of your journey with us?
Yes, I think it's probably easier if I kind of go backwards with it. I was watching a TED Talk, fascinating TED Talk by a young lady, probably when I was about 62, and it was on ADHD, and I remember sitting there thinking, wow, I tick every box for that. This makes so much sense of the way my mind works. And of course, initially when I left school, I was encouraged to go into office work. I was in data input. I worked for the post office, now British Telecom. Then after that, I worked for the Ministry of Defence. And I was perfectly capable of doing the job, but I was so bored. I was just so bored. And of course, when you look at the way the mind works with ADHD, boredom is your biggest enemy. So life took an interesting turn in that I'd always planned to travel the world and settle down maybe when I was about 28. But I met my husband when I was 19 and we fell in love. We got married actually very quickly. And so that changed everything because he was in the armed forces and he was in Northern Ireland finishing off a tour there. And then he actually was going to do a 2-year posting in Berlin. So apart from the fact that I fell in love and got married, I mean, it was quite fortunate for me in terms of my career because I don't know how long I would have stayed in that job being bored if I hadn't got married and my life had changed. But of course, everything changed going to live in another country, which at the time was behind the Iron Curtain. And so over the years, I've delved into many things. And I must say that I've enjoyed every single job that I've done apart from data input, whether it be counselling or whether it be being a personal trainer or all of the jobs that I've done over the years. And I spent many years in and out of selling property, which of course never bored me because I sold new property. So you sell a property, you're on to the next property, you're on to the next client. And of course, it's just constantly moving. And so that's kind of the reason behind why I've had such a varied career. And I think now at the age that I'm at now, where most people are retiring, what I've discovered through that understanding of how my brain does actually work, that I found the perfect work for me in that I'm an author. So I write either creatively or my last book is military research. That took military history, so that took a lot of research. And all of the things I'm doing now, doing public speaking, doing things like this, with you guys today, they're all things I'm interested in. I'm interested in the things that I research. And I'm also very interested in passing on knowledge. And so, they're all part and parcel of enjoying what you're doing. And of course, so boredom doesn't come into it anymore. So I think I'm pretty much settled now as to what I will continue to do for the rest of my life in kind of, various capacities.
Thank you. It seems like a common thread across your work has been dealing with grief from many angles. So can you say a bit about that?
Well, it's interesting that you say that actually, David, because even when you're selling property, you might be selling property, for example, to somebody who's coming down market and they're leaving a home they've had for 30 or 40 years. And there's grief that goes with that because they're leaving, their children are grown up, they're leaving a whole life behind. And so grief has come into every job I've done in one way or another. But I think it came mostly into my work when I worked in palliative care, because my remit was literally those who were terminally ill and their families. And so you're either supporting people who are going through the grieving process ahead of time because they have the knowledge that their family loved one is going to die. And then you have the patient, obviously, who has their own grief process because they're having to get their head around being terminally ill. And so I think for me, what has been, people call me an expert in the subject now, and I think that's twofold. It's because I've trained in that capacity as a bereavement counsellor. I've worked in that field, but I've also gone through an incredible amount of grief in my own personal life. And human beings, we're very experiential creatures, aren't we? You know, so we do best at the things that we actually understand experientially.
Thank you. So, is that what drew you to the work in palliative care then? Your own experiences?
Yeah, for sure. I think the interesting thing about it, looking back on it now, was that I was a little bit like a doctor who smokes and who has symptoms of lung cancer, but actually just tells everybody else to give up. And he knows how to deal with his patients. But while I was working in that area, then I had a great understanding of grief, but I still managed to suppress a lot of my own for a very long time because it kind of got layered. There were so many, you know, in the space of 18 months prior to my husband's death, I had 3 miscarriages, and my grandfather had died at the end of 1979. Then I'd had those 3 miscarriages. Then my husband got killed in a war. And then 2 years later, very suddenly, my own father died. So I lost the 3 most significant men in my entire life in the space of just over 4 years. So there was a lot of grief, you know, from relationships that I had had in one way or another and losses that I had had. But I was nevertheless very good at bearing it. And I think what happens looking back on it is we can all be clever with hindsight, but if you don't deal with anything in life, we know that it doesn't go anywhere. You can suppress it, you can put it into a box, you can compartmentalize. There's so many things you can do to avoid it, but it never goes away until you actually process it.
Thank you. It sounds like there's a bit of a circle here, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I understand you've also had 2 near-death experiences yourself. So did your work prepare you for that?
No, no, not at all. I think that I say not at all for the experience themselves and the vulnerability that came with it. But obviously, I had an idea of there is a grieving process again with serious illness. So not at all is probably not the right phrase. There was some preparation in there, but not for the actual experience of being immersed in it. And I look back on it now and think, actually, it was the toughest time of my life, but it brought out the best in me, you know, because I had built up over the years. I had a very dysfunctional childhood. To the point where you look back on it, and I'll give you an example of how dysfunctional my childhood was. When I was 16 years of age, my mother marched me to the doctors, and at that point I weighed 6 stone. And my mother told the doctor, "You need to sort this child out. She's either anemic or lazy." And of course I was neither. I didn't even know that I was actually formally diagnosed with anorexia. All I knew was that things were not good. And I hadn't even noticed how much weight I'd lost until I got invited to a friend's birthday party. And I hadn't been out of the house for weeks. When I went to put my clothes on, they were hanging on me. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, that's odd. These don't fit anymore. And that's how dissociated I had actually become. You know, I didn't look in a mirror. I just put the clothes on and thought, gosh. And so I didn't actually know that there'd been a diagnosis, and certainly no help was sought. which in the professions that we have been in historically, that's pretty horrific. And I was actually looking at my medical notes because of a car accident I had. I had to go through some notes that I got sent me when I was probably in my early 40s, when I actually saw my medical notes that said the diagnosis, the date. How I was still walking, I don't know, because my blood pressure was 90/60, and I weighed 6 stone. And so, when you're living in a family where people actually ignore the distress in you that is manifesting in that kind of an illness to the degree that they were, that's very telling. And of course, in extremely dysfunctional families, the worst thing for them, not for you, but the worst thing for them is for them to go and get help, because then the truth of everything that's going on might come out. So there was obviously a reason behind the fact that it was all kept quiet and no help was sought in terms of that. And so I've got, this is a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's all very relevant in that I had got a message from a very young age that I wasn't allowed to be vulnerable. Because if I showed any outward signs of vulnerability, they would be scoffed at or they would be ignored, but there wouldn't be a good result to it. And so, of course, what happens is the psyche is very good at protecting itself. The ego is very good at protecting itself. So I built up all these defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms over the years. I sometimes wonder where I would have ended up, had I not met my husband and had that one person who had truly loved me, warts and all. Because in a marriage, to make a marriage work, you've got to love the good, the bad, and the ugly in each other. Otherwise, you don't survive. So, I'm very grateful that that person came along and gave me that, even though I ended up losing it through a war. But going back to those near-death experiences, what happened when those two events happened quite close together? They were only 13 months apart. The first time my bowel perforated, and you only have hours before you're dead in that situation. And unfortunately, there was medical negligence attached to it, and I wasn't taken care of. And it's just by sheer luck that I survived, because people have died in less time. If you look at the length of time you've got from when you sort of go to this, to that, to sepsis, to organ failure, it was quite amazing that I did actually survive that one. But there were complications post the surgery. It was a 6-month recovery. And then 13 months after this happened, I'd had some symptoms and gone to the doctor and said, look, I just don't feel right. And my GP was somebody, back in those days, you could see the same GP, so she had known me for about 20 years. And she said, well, if you tell me that you don't feel right, then I know something's wrong. And so with my family medical history, the symptoms I was getting, she fast-tracked me to the cardiac unit. And the decision was made for me to have an angiogram, which they can do them with these newfangled machines now. But back then it was very much go in through the femoral artery. And I went in, I had a sedative, and the next thing I've woken up clutching my chest in excruciating pain. And there's this sea of people floating about, and this doctor saying to me, oh, don't worry, the morphine will kick in a minute. And I'm sitting there, or like laying there, should I say, thinking, what on earth do I need morphine for? And I came in for an angiogram. And what had happened was that as they were going in to try and find out what was going on with my heart, if you imagine that the heart, the left ventricle, it kind of pumps like that rhythmically normally. Actually, what I had was a stress cardiomyopathy, otherwise known as broken heart syndrome. No surprise with that one. It just took a while for it to happen. But once they gave me the sedative, they think what happened is that instead of it doing the rhythmic pumping, it just went, oh, and seized up and stopped. And so I was kind of down for about 2 minutes. And I always say when I do interviews about it, I was quite disappointed I didn't go anywhere. I wanted to see this, at least if I'm going to be down for 2 minutes, I want to see a white light or a tunnel or something and have a near-death experience. But no, I mean, it didn't happen. So they did tell me that it was very hard. I mean, the doctor told me afterwards, he said it was hard to bring me back. And I remember thinking, and I can be really honest, I mean, this is 10 years ago now, I can be really honest about it. There wasn't much of me that wanted to come back at the time. I always get emotional at this stage, and that's fine, but, you know, when
life... sounds like a really difficult period.
Oh my gosh, you know, life had kicked me down so many times. But in the end, you just sort of, you know, you wouldn't be human if you didn't sit there and think, I don't know if I can actually get up again this time. But here's the other thing that people, you know, look to me for as an expert in resilience now is that I don't do very well being on the floor. You know, it's not a place that's comfortable for me. And so as much as in that moment, if you'd have said to me, you know, then obviously I wasn't that keen on really coming back, which is probably why they struggled to bring me. But having come back, you know, then I'm kind of like, okay, so this is where we are. Where do we go from here? And within, you know, when I left the hospital, I said to the doctor, how long before I can go to the gym? And he looked at me like I was a bit crazy, you know, because I was in my 50s. And he said, give it 4 weeks. Because at that point, we didn't know. I was told my heart would not make a full recovery. I don't know if you know anything about troponin T, but, you know, it's the first thing they check for. It's an enzyme that should be contained within the heart, and they check for it. That's one of the first indicators of whether you've had some kind of a heart attack. And it should be below 20 in your blood levels. And mine was 8,917. And at 10,000, pretty much your heart is destroyed. So if I speak to any doctor, any medical doctor now, and I tell them about what happens, and I tell them my TROP-T levels, and I say I made a full recovery, they just look at me and say, how? And the answer is we don't know, but we suspect that it's probably because I've been fit all my life. Excuse me, that I had that ability to bounce back in a way that somebody who was unfit may not. Because the first thing the consultant said to me was, you will have heart muscle damage because of the, you know, the rates are too high. And so within kind of 4 weeks, I waited very patiently, went to the gym, did 6 sets of bicep curls, and went home and kind of took it from there. And about 6 weeks after the event, I did a 5-mile walk because I was actually planning on going to the Falklands that year and doing a big cross-country tab. And so, yeah, vulnerability, I truly understand now, is actually our biggest strength. We can avoid, as humans, we can do all sorts of things to try and avoid being vulnerable. But if we can immerse ourselves in vulnerability totally, and then we can work through things, whether they're past, present, that doesn't really matter. But usually what happens in these situations is everything that we haven't worked on, we'll rock up and kind of, you know, smack you in the face somehow. And actually what happened in that medical negligence was that my uncaring, abusive family rocked up in every guise. You know, there was the charismatic doctor that wasn't taking me seriously when I was in absolute agony, and my pain levels were riding between, you know, 7 and 10 on morphine and paracetamol and every pain relief I could have. You know, there's obviously something terribly wrong, but the guy's doing nothing to find out what. Well, what did that remind me of? Yeah. So, you know, I mean, that's why I've always loved, not just the studying of psychology. Now I've gone much more into the self-development side of that. And it's very much a case these days that when something comes up and presents to you that you might feel uncomfortable with, you might have a reaction to, the thing is, okay, so where's it coming from? Which part of you is still not healed that you've manifested that, And I manifested that family situation. There was the odd person, which reminded me of the person I used to call my adopted mum. I think she's the person I attribute my sanity to, because a friend of mine at primary school, I used to often stay at her mum's house like 3 days a week. And if I hadn't have had that reprieve from home, I don't know where I would have ended up. So there were the care workers in the hospital that gently bathed me when I had so many tubes coming out of me, I couldn't even move. I couldn't roll over, I couldn't get up, I couldn't do anything. It wasn't all bad. They were incredible people, and they bathed me when I couldn't bathe myself. And there were other people that were there that were kind to me. But then there were other people that were just in every guise, the physios. I'll give you an idea of how ridiculous this is. I had nothing by way of nutrition for 5 days other than a saline drip. So I was due to have TPN started, but it had arrived, but they hadn't set it up, and it was all very delayed and everything. So I'd had no nutrition barring a saline drip for 5 days, and the physios came round and accused me of not trying to help myself. And so there were other patients in the ward that were thinking that was what was going on, when in reality I had no calories in me.
Yeah.
I'd nearly died. I'd had the biggest bowel surgery you can ever have. I was physically, mentally, and mind, body and spirit, I was on the floor. And I'm getting bullied by these physios who don't seem to be able to use common sense to think, actually, she's probably going to struggle to walk 5 steps because she's got no calories in her, And so it was a case of all these teams there just not talking to each other. And then the dietitians came round and were really angry that I hadn't had the drip put up, and so there were people that were trying to fight my corner, and it mirrored every single thing in my life that I hadn't actually worked through. And I remain to this day, as horrible as these experiences were at the time, because I wouldn't exactly sign up for it. If you said, what would you like to do next week, I wouldn't be signing up for that voluntarily. But I look back on it now, and it's the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Maybe it could have happened in a more gentler way, but would I have taken notice? Because, the universe had been trying to give me these messages for quite a while. And I think the reality is you can have a client. I've had many clients that have done really good work with me over the years. I've had other clients that run away because they don't want to do the work for whatever. It may be that they're not ready. It may be that they'll never be ready. But we never deal with anything until we are ready, do we?
I think that's a really brilliant example, actually, Jay, of why it isn't okay, really, to just shove things to the back of our mind and think we don't have to deal with it, because these situations do arise where it comes up to bite us in the butt if we haven't addressed it. So, very clear example of why that was important. But what is it that you learnt from those experiences that made it so valuable despite the painfulness of it? Was it about embracing vulnerability and the need to look at this stuff, or were there other lessons you also took?
I think to be honest, Naomi, it was a twofold thing. In one, yes, by embracing vulnerability. And I also, when it happened, I also got thrown into a very brutal menopause, as if I wasn't dealing with enough, So that's a massive change in a woman's life anyway. So embracing the vulnerability almost through realising I didn't actually have a choice. It was going to be sink or swim this time round.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't just pick myself up, dust myself off as I had done historically. that was incredibly healing. But also there was something else that happened, was that I sued the NHS. And believe me, I didn't do it lightly. I think anybody who's ever had any experience of doing anything like that doesn't do it lightly. But we didn't get the report that we wanted or needed, for it to go with one of those new. I did have a solicitor, but with one of the no win, no fee firms. And so what they said to me when that report came through is, look, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take it forward, but you have two choices here. You can carry on as a litigant in person, take it on yourself, or we can write a letter. We can write a letter of claim. I'm just trying to think of legal terminology. It's a letter of claim. We can write that for you. And I explored what that meant. And don't ask me, again, it's one of those things that felt like the right thing at the time. But then when I look back at it, I think, what was I doing? Is I just sort of said, no, I'll do it as a litigant in person. Well, the only legal knowledge I had was back in my property days. I'd been a contracts manager. So I'm quite au fait with that kind of side of, but I didn't have any other knowledge. And I'm certainly not a lawyer. And so, me standing on my own up in front of, the judge in the High Courts of Justice, with all these extensions and things that I needed to go for and everything that went through that, it was pretty daunting. But if you look at it in terms of metaphorically how it was important in my life, what I was actually doing was I was standing up and saying, you don't get to do this to me. This was wrong on every level. You do not get to do this to me and get away with it. Now, if you're dealing with a dysfunctional family to the degree that I had one, what happened with me is I was made to be the scapegoat. And to this day, there's not many of them still alive now, but to this day, people think I'm a completely different person to the person I actually am. And there was one particular person, for example, I used to say to them, well, you're telling me that I'm this selfish human being and I'm this and I'm that and I'm something else. If that's true, why do I work in palliative care? It doesn't even make any sense. But of course, when you're talking to somebody that's incredibly manipulative and has no vested interest in truth, you can carry on talking till the cows come home and you're not going to get anywhere, are you? That's why, as we know, narcissists don't come for therapy very often. They haven't got a vested interest in getting better or taking responsibility. And so I couldn't get justice in my family of origin. And there were several times in life that I couldn't get justice in other situations. And so I was going to do the best I could to make sure I got justice in this situation. And I ended up going through hell. They are a big tooled up organisation, and they've got a whole team of lawyers behind them, and it was just me. But I ended up sticking it through, and I knew that I wasn't saying or doing anything that was wrong, and I wasn't going to just lie down and accept this. And they did put me through hell, but eventually when they realised that I wasn't going away, I did get an offer from them. And rather than take it to the next level, I accepted that offer because that's all I wanted was a sorry. It was not about me getting financially what I justly deserved. It was about that was the only sorry I was ever going to get.
And I think that's a common experience, isn't it? That people find the defensiveness when they're the victim of a patient safety incident is that reluctance to apologise and to take responsibility, and it's that leaves people really fired up. But what an amazing person you are in terms of it is like a David and Goliath situation when you're taking on a trust where they've got an apparently bottomless pit of money to pay for lawyers. So a phenomenal achievement. You've had so many painful life experiences, Jay, more than a person's fair share, and yet you've managed to hold on to the capacity to, come at things from quite a loving and kind perspective. How have you managed to hold on to your own sense of integrity and wholesomeness as a person?
That's actually brought a little tear to my eye now when you asked me that question, because I had a conversation with my best friend this morning about something completely different. And we were talking about integrity, and I think there'll be two things that will probably be on my gravestone. One will say she had integrity, and the other one will say we thought she'd never go. um, and I can always tell when I'm doing well mentally, because when I'm not doing well mentally, my sense of humour's, a bit scuppered sort of thing. And so at the moment, my sense of humour is very much intact. I think the interesting thing is if you look at narcissistic abuse and you look at the whole of the picture around narcissistic abuse, actually the one decent person in that whole setup is the scapegoat. If you look at the qualities of the scapegoats, they're not horrible people. They are made to be out to be horrible people because there's been a narrative written about them. Yeah. But they're not horrible people. And they're always the one that you want in your corner if you've got a problem, because they're very loyal and they'll fight tooth and nail for other people. And, it is very much what we're made of. It's an interesting question you've asked me, and I'm just working through how to answer it, actually, because there's been times when I wondered the answers to that question myself, like how have I not turned into an incredibly bitter and battered old bat, because I can add the old bit to it now, and I think part of it is because I am very sure of who I am at my core. That person that worked in palliative care that could sit and hold someone's hand when they were dying is just one facet of my nature. There's the fitness instructor that has somebody come in to see them who's had a stroke and who's 32 years of age and is trying to get back into fitness. There's so many different aspects to my work, but the one common theme throughout all of it has been I'm at my best when I'm helping people. And so I think being kind is hugely part of my nature, but I've learnt through life that if I'm unkind, and we all are sometimes, none of us are perfect, we've all got our foibles, but if I'm unkind, I pay way too much a high price for that. Because I'm the one that has to look at me in the mirror every day, and I'm the one that has to sleep, with my in my and be in my head 24 hours a day. And so I can't say that I'm a perfect person by any means, but being kind is just part of who I am. And I'm quite happy for people to call me the scapegoat. They can carry on with their narratives if they want to, because I'm living my life just being me.
Sounds like you've really made that kindness part of your identity, but I was also thinking about your love of learning and growing, and it sounds like you kind of adopt that sort of mindset when you're faced with a challenge. So you try and see what it is you can take, making lemonade out of lemons, so to speak, trying to think, well, this might be an awful situation, but how can I grow from it? What advice would you give to others having to deal with the pain of loss?
Buy my book.
Well,
The Falklands Widow is my journey through grief. It's all about the stages of grief. Those are written within it, but it's also a very good guide of how not to do it, because you can bury it for as long as you want to. It's not going to go away. It'll never go away. But if you allow process, and I'll give you an example of just allowing process, is that during lockdown, a good friend of mine died quite suddenly. And I've learned I don't fight, this process anymore. And of course, when it's sudden, you've got no warning. You just get a phone call one day and you get the news. And I sat and I just cried for a whole week. And I grieved. And I processed it. And so by the time the funeral came around, I was pretty much at the point of acceptance. And I was, very, very lucky to be able to go to his funeral, because during lockdown, you had the thing where you could only have 30 people there and all that nonsense.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to be able to go and have the choice to say goodbye to somebody and have that ceremony. But yeah, the biggest advice I give people, I say tongue in cheek, buy my book, but it really is. It's a helpful guide, I think, for professionals and for people who may have lost somebody. But also, it's about let yourself process it. You're going to go through, and we used to teach counselling skills courses when I worked at the hospital, specifically aimed at bereavement. And one of the things we used to teach was, grief's everywhere. If you lose your purse, you'll have a grieving process, especially if you've got your grandmother's locket in it. And you can go and buy another purse, but you can't get Granny's locket back.
Yeah.
So there will be those things with every disappointment that we have in life. But if you learn to allow process and not fight it and not be scared of it, and I truly do believe as well that if GPs knew more and understood more about grief, there'd be a lot less antidepressants being prescribed every day in practices around the country. Because depression is a natural part of grief, but I wonder how many times people actually ask you when you go into those appointments, have you actually had a bereavement recently? Or is there something, they're not looking so much for the cause. We know with everything in life, everything in the universe, cause and effect. If you look for the cause and you see the cause, then you understand the effect.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jay. And we'll share a link to your book in our show notes. And do you have a website as well?
I do, yes.
Yeah, and we'll share a link to that as well. But thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm glad you overcame all the travails of technology, and we've had a jolly good conversation.